Salutations, viewers. This is George from Ireland, and today I'm going to talk about the History A-level topic, Causes of the American Civil War. We need to look at the background first of all. You may know there were 13 British colonies on the east coast of America, and in 1776 the American Revolution began. The British descended settlers, they rebelled, and they declared independence. The United States was founded. The 13 colonies turned it into 13 states. More states were added. The United States expanded further westward, claiming more territory from the Native Americans. But long before that, British people had kidnapped African people, or indeed sometimes purchased African slaves who'd been enslaved by fellow Africans, and taken these unfortunate people across the Atlantic and forced them to work as slaves in these colonies on the east coast of America and in many Caribbean islands. So the slaves were abominably treated. They suffered great cruelty, whippings, torture, rape, murder, and so on, and horrendously exploited. Anyway, slaves were a major part of the economy of some of the southern colonies, or the southern states of the United States as it became. Let's look at the Constitution of the United States a little bit. It becomes important in this. There was a president who was elected by the 1850s. Virtually all white men had the right to vote if they become citizens, and each state had a number of electoral votes, which led to the president being elected. It gets a bit complicated. We won't go into it too much. There's Congress. Congress is the equivalent of Parliament. Each state has 2 senators. There's a Senate in Congress and a House of Representatives. So there are 2 senators per state, regardless of the population of the state. So the state with the largest population still has 2 senators. The state with the smallest population still has 2 senators. Whereas in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives per state is in relation to the size of the population of that state. So the state with the biggest population has the most representatives, and the state with the smallest population has the fewest representatives. At this time, the federal government was quite weak. The federal government's based in Washington, D.C. It was to manage foreign affairs, the army, the navy, the dollar, and not much else. The states had a great deal of power. The states could manage their affairs and do things quite differently. There were different laws in different states. So by 1861, the northern states had all abolished slavery. They had very few black people who were enslaved there anyway. The black people who were in the northern states, that were a tiny minority, and they'd become free well before 1861. The southern states were very agricultural, whereas the northern states were more industrial by this stage. Yes, there certainly were farmers in the northern states, but agriculture was not so vital to the economy of the northern states, whereas the southern states were almost exclusively agricultural. So the slaves were exploited on plantations growing things such as cotton, which was, they used to talk about king cotton, the most important export crop, tobacco, to a lesser extent sugar, sometimes food crops. The first African Americans who'd been were in America since 1619. So some people in the South had manumitted their slaves, as in recognized their right to be free. Particularly this was done in a will. But African Americans, even if they were free, were not treated with equality. They were treated with great injustice. Some states had a law even forbidding black people being taught to read. So, as I say, Congress based the amount of representation a state got in the House of Representatives on the size of the population. So some Northerners pointed out there are a lot of black people in the southern states, and they're not allowed to vote even if they're free because the law discriminates against them. So the southern states will get a lot of representation even for people who were not allowed to vote. So they decided, for the purpose of representation, black people would count as 3/5 of a human, which is horrific and grossly unfair, but it tells you a lot about the mindset of the time. Unfortunately, this sort of racist attitude was not confined to the United States. White people in other parts of the world were often racist in the same manner. Some slaves were escaping. Harriet Tubman was a woman who was a slave herself, who escaped and then she founded the Underground Railroad, which is not really a railroad. It's just a system of helping people escape to freedom. So she's a very courageous woman, and she got to the northern states where slavery was outlawed, and she valiantly returned several times to the South to help other people escape. She's now being honored on the $20 bill. The United States in the 1840s had two major political parties, the Democrats, which still exists, and the Whigs, which does not. Then at that time, another party was found called the Republican Party, which is still going. And the Whig Party gradually broke up and disappeared for reasons I shan't go into. People talked about two sections of the United States, the North and the South. It was not quite clear where the North and the South were. There was a Mason-Dixon line, and south of that, slavery was allowed in those states. North of it, it wasn't. But as you might see in the next video, not all the states which retained slavery were going to break away. So there was a growing abolitionist movement in the United States saying that slavery is grossly evil and must be abolished. It's an imperative we do this. It should be a federal law. It's not a state issue. It's so important. Other countries, such as the United Kingdom, had abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833. Now, some of the pro-slavery people said, well, it's a state issue, as well as trying to put forward the ludicrous argument that slavery was somehow fair or reasonable. So some Southerners would say it's bad that Northerners are hostile towards us, are trying to take away our property. By property they meant other human beings. So perhaps we ought to break away. We broke away from the United Kingdom. Why don't we break away from the United States? So in the early 1850s, that seemed to be a lunatic fringe idea. Those in the South who proposed breaking away from the United States were called fire eaters and were seen as hotheads. However, as the 1850s moved on, this notion of breaking away from the United States became more popular. But there was still a lot of pro-union feeling in the South. There was a considerable number of people who said, despite our ructions, we ought to remain part of the United States. As one politician said, the North and the South were made for each other, just like Adam and Eve. There was one organization in the South called the Knights of the Golden Circle, who fantasized about conquering a lot more territory and adding dozens of slave states to the United States, which would give the pro-slavery lobby in Congress a massive majority. The United States had been to war against Mexico in the 1840s and had conquered a lot of territory, what we now call California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Texas. Although Texas had been independent briefly before that, that's where they have Spanish language toponyms in those states. Some of them thought they should conquer Cuba, then a Spanish colony, and the Knights of the Golden Circle said, well, we'll have a massive pro-slavery country ever within 2,000 miles of Havana, Cuba. It didn't come to pass. Some of these Knights of the Golden Circle, they even invaded Nicaragua, but they were defeated. And this was one of the major contentious issues. As the United States expanded westward, and Americans settled there and formed a territory and then applied for this territory to be admitted to the United States, should that state be admitted to the United States on the basis of being a slave state or a free state? And they talked about bleeding Kansas at the time. In Kansas and then Missouri, people were fighting over whether these territories ought to be admitted to the USA, allowing slavery or outlawing slavery. Bear in mind that about 80% of people in the United States were white at the time. There were very few Hispanic people in the United States back then. There are lots of Hispanic Americans these days. A high majority of Americans were WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, as in their ancestors came from Ireland or Great Britain. Again, a high majority of people in the USA were Protestants. At the time, there was some anti-Catholic prejudice around. Another salient issue in the 1840s was increasing Irish Catholic immigration. Most Irish people who moved to the United States up until that time had been Protestants. There was a lot of German immigration as well due to economic hardship in Germany, the failure of the 1848 revolution in Germany. So some people who disliked these immigrants for being Catholics, German, formed the know-nothings, as in if they were questioned about their organization, they would say, I know nothing. The know-nothings were virulently anti-immigrant. Incidentally, not all the Germans who were coming were Catholics, only about half of them. So that's enough for the moment. Then we'll look at the 1850 Compromise in the next video.